So welcome. I'm going to be talking custom to contrib, rebuilding a module from custom to contrib, and using our localist example, localist module as an example. So this talk is primarily for folks who have previously built a custom module and are maybe thinking of moving into the contrib space. Thank you to the sponsors. Make sure that we give them a shout out for sure. So who am I? My name is Marc Berger, and I'm a senior engineer at 4 Kitchens. We are a web agency that handles large content websites. I've been a Drupal developer since about 2014 or so. Cut my teeth on Drupal 7 for Santa Rosa Junior College, doing a major website transition. But I've been doing web development since around '96 or so, hand coding websites back in the day when we could do that kind of thing. But I've also built many full builds, and these days I'm more back-end PHP. Off the screen, I love to hike and do cooking and baking. Legos was mentioned earlier today, so happy to hear about that. And weirdly, in my off time, I like to program in Minecraft using Redstone. Go figure. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're using we built a module called Localist Drupal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Localist is, how our module came to be, give a little demo, and then our lessons learned from this process. So Localist. This is an event management platform. And what they do is you can have a nice dashboard where you can enter events, and they have a branded solution that showcases your events where you can filter and sort and search. And it's a really, really nice platform. I'm not affiliated with them, but I did work with them when I built this module. They allow you to also embed your event lists onto your own website, just like a standard embed, like YouTube or Instagram. But they also have an API, and that's where we came in. So what does our module do? Under the hood, it utilizes Drupal migrations and all those APIs in order to grab the data coming out of Localist and import it into Drupal. We had to write some custom migration plugins to do so, and we've got it set up so that it will run every hour on cron to import that data. But there's some new stuff that we added, because the previous 3 bullet points, those are all what we wrote for the custom module. And the contrib module includes a bunch of UI improvements, pre-flight checks, I'm going to show all this off too, installable examples, that's with the recipes, and really expanded documentation, which is very important for something like this that can be kind of complex. So this module was originally built for Yale University, and they have a new platform that was launched earlier, actually it was late last year, called Yale Sites. It is a multi-site platform, and they had some really large, ambitious goals for this project, and one of which was they wanted to be able to import these events from Localist so that people could see the events on Drupal mixed with Drupal content. They didn't want the embed. They can still do the embed if they want it, though. They also wanted very specific styling and formatting of the events, specifically the dates, and they wanted to keep people on the site. All right, enough talk for a little bit. Let's see if I can do a demo. There we go. Okay. So this is Localist, the front end, and this is for Yale. And this is hosted, so you could utilize their solution. Allows you to do filtering, sorting, searching, of course. It's branded, so it looks just like Yale. And if you go into a particular event, you have all sorts of information about it. Actually, this one here I think is a better example. There we go. So So you can see down here, there's a bunch of metadata that's associated with this event. And this is the kind of stuff that we want to import to Drupal. So if we take a look at one of the Yale sites, this is a specific department on Yale sites. This is the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and this is their upcoming events page. So this is just a view in Drupal that's pulling in event nodes. And if we take a look at one, hey, look at that. We've got a bunch of metadata that's part of this node. Now the top part here, this is coming from localhost. But the bottom part, there's an artist bio. Now we're on the same site, it's not an embed, this is coming from Drupal. So this is the kind of thing that we wanted to make possible. All right, so we've got a clean Drupal 10 site. I'm going to go ahead and install the module. And notice right now the only thing, this is using the standard profile, so nothing there. All right, live demo, don't fail me. So a couple things to note before we install. This requires a couple of contrib modules. Oh, hey, go away. Because it's using the migrate APIs in Drupal, it needs migrate, of course. We're also utilizing some functions of the migrate plus and migrate tools, which are popular modules in the migrate space. And we're also requiring the smart date module because we found that it's the best way to store dates from localhost. We did try this with the core date field, and it works, but the smart date field gives the ability to do reoccurring dates a little bit easier. So once this module is installed, so let's go a little bit smaller here. Oh, where's my hover? There we go. It's going to import some very base configuration that it needs. So it's going to import a taxonomy vocabulary called localist groups. There's nothing in here at the moment, but this is a requirement for how we are operating the module. So we'll go into our settings form. There we are. I'm going to go ahead and enable it, and I'm going to give it an endpoint-based URL. So you're going to get this from your localist representative, or if you're already using a custom domain like Yale is, I'm just going to use theirs. There we go. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and save the config so that it will enable all the rest of the fields. So this is something else that we added. The previous module, the one that was built just for Yale, only had the endpoint-based URL, and it had the group migration. That's it. I'm sorry, it didn't even have the group migration. That was hard-coded. It had the group field, because we already were able to import all the groups from Yale, because we knew what it was. But here, we couldn't make that assumption. So we have a group migration. And all this is, behind the scenes, is just a YAML file with this ID. And when we click on create groups, it's going to run that migration. That's all it's going to do. But before we get to that, right up top is the pre-flag check. We need to make sure that things are set up in an appropriate way before we even do the migrations, because we need certain things in place. So you can see we've got the endpoint-based URL that is returning data from localhost. We know that. We've got a YAML file in the code base for the groups. And the next thing is well, you haven't imported the groups yet, and it tells you what to do. Create the groups. And like I said, what this is doing behind the scenes is it's going out to localhost, it's doing a migration, and it's importing those taxonomy terms right into Drupal. Cool. 149 groups imported. We'll take a look at those in a moment. The last thing is that you need to set a group. These are departments, essentially. Like if you're talking about an education environment, this would be your department. And for Yale, I happen to know that their West Campus has been actively importing events, or adding events. So I'll just select them. This is an autocomplete just coming from the taxonomy. At this point, we got green check marks across the board. So my live demo is working. And at this point, can we import events? Well, again, we can't make any assumptions. What happens if you have your own event content type already on the system and you want to utilize that? Sure, you can do that. All you have to do is write a migration that does that using our custom plugins. But what if you wanted to get started right away and see how this thing works without having to write any code? So what we've done is we're using the new recipes initiative. There's a recipe that gets installed if you say, hey, I want to create an example. So I've seen this as a very typical thing in certain modules where it's like a sub-module that you install. And when you install that, all it does really is it imports config to create some content types and some default content, default configuration. Well, we're just doing that with a recipe. So I'm going to click Create Example. And what does that do? What did that do? Ultimately, it created a content type called localist event, and it created another taxonomy term called localist places. And this is so that we can showcase how to import taxonomy information from localist into Drupal. But the last thing it did is it actually filled in these two configs. This last one is the actual event migration ID. And then the dependency migrations are anything you want to be run ahead of time. And usually that's for your taxonomy terms or any previous or any other data that you want to be connected. So the last thing is, now we're all set up. I'm going to click Sync Now. And remember, we set this to the West Campus, so it's going to pull the events from West Campus right into Drupal. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think I missed something. You clicked a button inside of Drupal that ran the recipe?
Yes.
Oh, very interesting.
Because again, recipes are not installable as we... there was a session earlier where he says you apply a recipe, right? So essentially we're applying that recipe.
So you actually executed, so there's the code that's sitting in the scripts directory that applies recipes. That's what you did behind the scenes?
Actually, I can show the code base as to where everything is located. Yep. Yeah, we'll go there next. Actually, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've imported our stuff, and let's just take a look. There they are. A bunch of events right from West Campus. And if we click on one of these, we're obviously importing a title. We're importing a description. This is a WYSIWYG field over on Localist, so we made this a WYSIWYG field in Drupal so that you can set bold and italics and that kind of stuff. The dates, and this does support multi-date because Localist supports that. And then our place. This is the taxonomy term that is coming over. And so in Localist, you set that as a place. Well, we're bringing that right over into just a node that's connected up to a taxonomy term. So let's take a look at the module a little bit internally. This is that example event YAML file. Is that big enough for everybody?
Yeah, the right side is. The left side's a little small.
Gotcha. How's that?
That's better.
Good. Thank you. Turn off the terminal. We don't need that right now. So if you've written a migration in the past, this should look very familiar to you. There's just a couple of different changes. For example, we've got some custom migration plugins that you need to use in order for this to work. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just a migration file. And so because we provide these examples, you can copy this, paste it right into your custom module, and then edit it to put in whatever fields you currently have, or if you're creating a new content type, just create that content type and then just map your fields right in here. Now, we understood that this can be tricky for those who are new to migrations. And so what we did was we wrote a bunch of documentation around this. So this is the README file that's in the module itself. I'm not going to go through the entire thing, of course, but it's here for anybody who wants to know how this works, and also, of course, the biggest one, overriding. Like, how do you create your own migrations for this? We did include Drush generate as well, which will ask a couple of questions on the command line and will automatically generate a migration file and put it into your custom module. And then from there, you would just modify it. You would just add in the various fields that you would need to bring in from local disk. And I'm going to go back to code here, and we can look at the recipe. It's a great question. So I've got just a subfolder into the module called recipes, and there's the example. So there's the recipe YAML file. It's very simple. Just make sure that certain modules are installed. It's got a config action for our own module that says, hey, you need to set these values into our config. But the bulk of it is under the config directory here. And this is what sets up the actual content type and the taxonomy vocabulary. Now, I know that recipes are still in the experimental, but this is how we're doing it. Make this a little bit smaller. It's doing a recipe runner, essentially. And it looks for the actual, we point it at the actual, we point it at the actual recipe file that we have in our module, and then it runs it sort of under the hood internally. So you're not running the standard command line PHP recipe installation. Application. But that's how we're doing this way. It was kind of a fun experiment to see if recipes could be used in a different way, for example. So before I leave the demo, does anybody have any questions?
Okay, so can you show me again are you importing nodes?
We are, during the migration, yes.
During the migration, okay. But you're not when you apply the recipe.
Correct.
You're just importing configuration.
Correct.
And that's just regular YAML configuration that is done using Drupal.
Yep.
Config export, okay?
Yep. Exactly. So, where did they go? Where am I?
Can you show that again?
Sure. Yeah, so here's our config. This is getting a little tight here. There we go. So you can see these are just standard config files that sets up the fields on a node, sets up the node itself, and sets up the taxonomy vocabulary.
Right. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. And with recipes, if you got existing config, you wouldn't do it this way. You would do it with a config action, which is inside of the recipe file. So we know that this here already exists as part of the site. We're just doing a config update using the config action.
Right. And are you following the whole thing about the strict flag?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, so there's a new strict flag that's going into 10.4,
Uh-huh.
and you might be able to apply a recipe without using a secondary method like you just did, if it already has configuration that exists.
Uh-huh.
If strict is false, you get to slam over it anyway.
Oh, I see.
If strict is on, then it will. Then
I've not heard about that. That's fantastic.
So that's going to get relaxed
Okay.
if you change the flag.
Right. Okay. Where does the flag get changed? Do you know?
It would be in the main recipe file.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Just right in here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. You have any question? No. Okay. All right. So now, will my displays behave? Hey, it works. So some of this is going to be kind of what we talked about a little bit, but now we're getting into the lessons that we learned for this. So, for example, when we were building this for Yale, we had a code base that we knew. and we assumed a lot. We assumed config was there. We assumed a lot of content types and fields and all sorts of things were already there. But of course, we cannot assume that when we're building for the community. So we had to set up a bunch of internal code checks to make sure that things were set up properly. Likewise, we wanted to make those checks available to the end user. So we created the little green and red checkboxes, and to tell people, hey, you still need a group migration, and the group migration needs to be set up in a very specific way. We also, of course, I mentioned in the previous version, we had very minimal documentation. We expanded that documentation greatly, and a lot of that documentation is going over how migrations work. We also didn't have any examples, of course. We didn't need that. Yale was going to be teaching all of their departments on how to use this thing. A lot of it was hard-coded. So when we moved to this version, we wanted to make sure that there was something that you could install and use right away. There were some things that we removed. So they wanted a bunch of custom styling and formatting options. Well, we couldn't put that in there because, again, that's just making assumptions about how this module is going to get used, how people want it to look. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is just data that's going to be in your database. We don't want to make any assumptions on how you format it. The nice thing is you can create your own custom module that lives right alongside and add those customizations yourself. We also did have some issues where we had to rely on some patches from the community. They worked great, but it made the installation process a little bit tricky. So what we did was we rebuilt pieces of the module so that it didn't have to rely on those patches, and just makes it a lot easier to install. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we did create the Drush generator, so it was a little easier to create your first migration file. So one thing that dawned on me was that I just wrote 2 modules. I wrote custom one, and then I went back and I wrote contrib one. Now granted, there was a lot of shared code, but it was a lot of work. So I was thinking, well, wait a minute. Maybe I should have written the contrib module first, and then customized it for the client. Could we have saved time? I love this quote. When we have welcoming communities of contributors, open source software gets better and more useful to everyone. And I think this is where I'm getting to, is can we do contrib first instead of custom? Can we sort of think a little bit differently on how we're doing the development? Maybe. I mean, when was the last time that you went out to Drupal.org because you had a problem that you needed solved, and hey, lo and behold, there was a module there ready to go for you to use to install. And for the most part, it solved the problem. I also found that rebuilding this module made me a better developer, ultimately, because I was writing better documentation. I was doing these internal code checks. I was making sure that the module is going to work for the biggest audience possible. And yes, when I started this project, it was literally just me. And I did have some help with a colleague, but ultimately it felt daunting. It felt a little overwhelming. But if you put it out there, rather than it being in a custom code base, and put it out to Drupal.org, well, now you potentially have access to a greater amount of developers who might want to help. Now, if you've never contributed before, say you've only made custom modules, and you want to get into this whole thing, you don't have to dive right into the deep end. You can start small. It took me years before I was able to develop a contrib module. This is only my second module that's on Drupal.org, and I've got like 2 others that are in the works. I'm kind of addicted at this point. So you can start small. Drupal's always looking for documentation help. If you find that you have looked up, for example, a piece of documentation that's maybe a little outdated, update it. There's always the issue queues where you can get involved in discussions, and add a patch. This gets you involved in the community, but it also gets you involved in the processes that are around Drupal.org and how everything works. Before you start, you can always just develop the module on your own repo and use Composer to pull it in. I've got some examples if you wish. And that way you don't have to worry about any of the processes on Drupal.org to begin with. You can just start like on GitHub or wherever you'd like to host and just pull it into your project and work on it in that way. And the last one was one that I definitely wanted to mention, is I didn't realize the process around the security coverage. See that little badge in the top of modules that say this is not, covered by the Drupal security coverage. Well, my first module that I published probably about a year ago or so had that badge on there. And a coworker of mine says, hey, you really should get rid of that. So I didn't know how that worked, so I looked into it. It's a whole process, but it's actually not hard. It takes time. And ultimately, it's just that you're applying via just like an issue. You're putting an issue into a queue, and you have other developers who are looking at your module to make sure that it is safe. So I've got these resources. You don't have to worry about seeing that. I've got a link to the slides at the end if you wish. But these resources are for how do you contribute documentation? How do you contribute patches? How do you manage a Drupal.org project? There's a lot of documentation around this stuff, and it's fantastic. I guess the question, though, is does this work for everybody? And maybe not. There's a couple of different things that always go into these kinds of decisions. There's always time and budget constraints, of course. Doing a contrib module instead of a custom module can take a lot of extra time. And of course, sometimes you work for a company who has proprietary, wants proprietary control over that code, and so you can't put it out for everybody. Or maybe your project is really, really narrow in scope, and so it just really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You don't have to do contrib first. It's just something that we ought to think about. Because I think ultimately, we want to empower the entire community. And even if it's something as small as like maybe a form alteration, or maybe it's a custom field that holds data in just a slightly different way, if that might help somebody else out there, go for it. It doesn't have to be a huge module. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming to the talk. I would love any questions that you might have. This is my first Drupal talk, so I've got a little feedback, so I would appreciate some feedback on it. I'm planning on giving a similar talk at DrupalCon in Atlanta if I get approved. So it would be wonderful to hear anything that I can do better. So.
Fantastic.
So I have a question on this topic, but from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Just built a website, hired people to do it. Part of our statement of work was if you build anything custom for me, you have to have a plan to roll it out as a contrib module to the larger community.
Excellent.
Kept them very confined to not custom coding. Great. But I literally had to write it into our statement of work, and I got tons of pushback from the agency not wanting to do that. So do you have advice about how to deal with, as a customer who's going to be engaging someone to do this work for you, how you can be a good partner, make them be a good partner, so that everybody can, so how do you manage that? If you're a customer, like CKO, for example, you built something custom for them. You took that work, they paid you for, and gave it away for free. Were they good with that? Was it part of your statement of work? Did you get their okay? Was that drawing up a contract that you'd be allowed to do that?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. It really is. I know that there have been some clients who have been hesitant to put their work out into the world. With Yale and some of the other clients who are very open to it, I think a big piece of it is that they get their name out there too. And when I wanted to make sure that I could even mention them in this talk, for obvious reasons. And they were very happy. They said, oh, absolutely, talk about our platform. And I think a part of it is not just the work getting out into the field, but it's getting the names and the people to showcase how much of the community is there. You know, if you say, you know, I'll use Yale, why not? That we're out there supporting the community, well, now it's sort of like another voice that adds to the community.
Okay. And you didn't have to like go through your legal department or any of that. You just maybe talked to the people you worked with directly.
Correct. Yeah. We didn't talk to any of those folks. We talked to like the project owner, who was absolutely on board. Sort of helped that he was a Drupal developer back in like the Drupal 5 and 6 days. So.
Yeah.
Can I say something about that? First of all, that's awesome that you wrote that in, so that there's code getting back to the community. And I can also see the perspective of the agency pushing back. Because that's the agency is signing up for maintenance of something. And unless the contract also provided ongoing funding for that, if I were the agency, I would push back too. So how did that all end?
It stopped them from building custom code.
Really?
Which was the goal I had in mind to begin with. I was trying to put a financial tag on it. I didn't want them building something custom. I wasn't asking for anything that required custom.
Okay.
I will in the future, when we were building sort of MVP, you know, the minimum product we could build that we could then grow off of. So the thing was that they didn't, and that's how, but like, that was the thing. They're like, well, you have to keep contributing to it. And I said, yes, you would. So think carefully about whether or not you need to build this custom thing. And they did think carefully, and then they chose not to. So I would have liked to have gotten what I did. I still got what I
Oh, well,
wanted.
that's fantastic.
But I really did. I was disappointed that their pushback was not where bigger parts of the community that helped. It also helped me know that that's not the
And it's not just the
moving forward, because they're not contributing back, and they're hesitant to do so, and they didn't give me the happy conversation I was looking for, which is Drupal's great, open source is great. We make money off this, so of course we'll contribute back.
Yeah.
Give them a lot of money to build that site.
Yeah, I think certainly a portion of it is that I'm fortunate to work for an agency who is very open to contributing back. And I think a part of it too is getting, you know, our name out in the community to say, hey, we're happy to help the community. We've got, you know, 2 or 3 people who are core contributors. And it's really neat that we can, you know, certainly we put our stamp on it, but I think there's also an aspect that like, hey, we're part of this community. And, you know, other agencies might be different, that's all.
Well, Four Kitchens has a reputation of contributing a lot over the years. So it's kind of unique in that regard. Although there is a top tier of agencies that do put a lot of effort into core.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I think the agency that you were working with, maybe they didn't see, I mean, I see it, a lot of people see it, the value of contributing, because now you have developers that are knee-deep, they have contacts, because you cannot build a Drupal site yourself. You have to rely on the community. If you don't have your network of people that you can go to on Slack or wherever, you're going to hit blockers and you're going to be frustrated. And so the key to getting projects up and running quickly, in my experience with Drupal, is relying on all the people that you can reach out to and say, hey, whatever happened with blah, 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 that sort of thing. Or they see your comment on an issue and they respond quicker than they might have because they know you. So that agency, yeah, it's very interesting. Like in the selection process, now maybe you could go back and you could say, answer these 5 questions, because there are, like, for sure, universities and governments are often now writing in, you have to be a valid, not prominent, but you at least have to be visible, contributing back to the Drupal community, which is great.
Yeah.
So tagging on this, I think it's fascinating that you inserted that requirement, and it worked. It ended up working out, I think, as you put it, because you actually did not want anything. There was no need for there to be something custom. But in many cases, depending on the project, there could be a need for custom, and so it's something that's very hard for clients in general to just sort of make a blanket statement like that's a requirement for our vendors. And I do take the points around, you know, there's a cost to maintaining something that you know, publish out there, and that could put people off, particularly if there's not a market for it. If it's such a niche need,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, you could make a contributed module for it, but if there's no market for it, if nobody wants to use it, kind of what's the point?
Right.
What kind of analytics do you have? How many people are using the one you contributed?
The previous one, not this one. This one was literally just put online about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And it's in beta because we are still testing out load testing on it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is using the migration APIs, so we're pretty hopeful that it's not going to break because you've got thousands of events coming in.
Right.
But we've tested it with several hundred and it works fine. So still in beta. So the previous one that I wrote is called Reading Rating, and it just adds a little JavaScript to the bottom of a text field so that as you're typing it says, hey, this is easy to read, this is moderate, this is really difficult to read. You might want to try rewording it. But only like 5 or 6 people have it installed. So
I was really asking to maybe get an idea of how long you might have to spend in the coming months or
Sure.
years maintaining the new one.
mm-hmm.
I would imagine big Drupal instance, their updates would require a bunch of work, but I would hope that large, unless you do a large update, you don't have to do a ton of work maintaining it.
In general, if you stay on top of the APIs, and like, for example, I did mention I am using a little bit of recipe magic on the inside. What happens if the recipe stuff changes, right? So we'd have to make sure that we update our code for that. Yeah.
So I'm sort of sensing a pattern here from what you presented and what I've seen for some other modules that consume third-party APIs.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Salesforce module consumes the Salesforce API, and it implements mapping of Salesforce things, objects, whatever they are, right, to Drupal entities in a different way,
Mhm.
right? They chose to provide a UI that lets you map Drupal entities to Salesforce objects, and like that was a cool solution. You had a different solution, right? The migrate API-based solution to help people connect the dots to their
In their instance, the way that they want to do
content
that.
types and things.
Absolutely.
I wonder if there's an opportunity out there for this class of modules, right, dealing with third-party APIs to collaborate on some system to help provide maybe both possible solutions in sort of a scalable way, so that any third-party API that's consumed by a module that has this general class of problem of needing to map, fields to Drupal things could do that. Maybe the migrate UI module or something has some of that already. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's certainly tricky in some respects because, for example, the way that Localist API is formatted can be very different than, say, the Salesforce API. And so you don't know where your unique keys are, for example, or if you're trying to get a particular data, well, maybe that's like 2 or 3 different calls to different endpoints. So it can be tricky for sure. I remember the feeds module from Drupal 7. Loved that thing, right? But that was pretty generic in terms of like trying to lay like something for everybody. Yeah.
So I know how I would answer this question because I too enjoy having contributed modules. And I saw some of the different things you had to do when you made a contributed module versus the custom. So here's my question to you. What did you enjoy about making a contributed module of that whole process? Because you said you enjoyed it. And
I did,
So
yeah.
what's so pleasing that's different about contributed modules versus custom?
There's like this excitement angle in a way before you. I've never been an actor or somebody who has done like stage plays or anything like that, but I gather from the people who are on the side before you go out on stage, that kind of excitement before you showcase to the world your talents. There is a little bit of that where it's like, yeah, I made a custom thing and it works, but who's going to see it? Right? There's a very small percentage of people who are really going to see it and use it. Well, wait a minute. Now this is going to go out to everybody. I want to make sure I get it right. But there's also an angle of like, well, but I don't know how people are going to use it. So I had to really think about all these different pieces. And I thought that was really fascinating and kind of fun in a weird way of like, well, beforehand everything was hard-coded. Well, we can't do that. So I have to provide some foreign fields. Well, wait a minute. I need certain migrations to run before other migrations, so I need to do it in a certain way. So I thought that was really kind of fun, like the planning of it. I mean, certainly I love writing code, so that helps. But there was the planning angle, which I really liked.
And that's my experience too. Making a contributed module, you have to do far more planning. Not just initially, because you want to handle more use cases, but you also have to know which use cases you absolutely aren't going to handle, where you're going to add a piece of code that you're going to have to maintain for thousands of years. And it's going to be the pain in the butt
Right.
Forever. And then, of course, then you go down and it's a few years and you realize, oh, I should have added that feature. And you learn.
Yes.
And you start to realize what is the core functionality of this module, and you have to become a better developer to understand what is really solving the issue for the possible client.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I remember when we first talked to the localist folks about this, and they hadn't really even thought about it. They were aware of Drupal, but they just sort of said, well, just embed it. Just use the embeds. And they're great. I mean, they're nice embeds, but that's all they are. They're just like a little, mini scrollable widget of your events. And we wanted something deeper than that. And I think that getting it out there to tell people, like, we wouldn't have done this if they didn't have an API, right? I think the fact that they made that available, I thought that was a wonderful on their part. Yeah.
So the button you press to run the recipe, I love that. Two questions. One, have you encountered other modules that have taken that approach?
I haven't.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
the first time I've seen it.
Yeah, it's the first time I was going to do it. Yeah.
Joomla does it all the time.
Who? I'm sorry?
Joomla.
Really?
CMS, they have that. It's like it opens up and then you have to go through all of these little checkbox processes before it will, and it's for things like backups, where you have to do a whole bunch of prep work to get a good backup. But that's where I'd seen that before.
Nice. Yeah.
Then my second, not exactly a question, I guess, is I wonder if this model, right, where a module is shipping a recipe, I wonder if there's any value in replacing that with like some sort of cloud-based recipe that the module can just sort of run the latest version of. Or
I
something.
like.
And I guess it's kind of like a project browser. But I'm not sure where all these pieces converge. but-
Sure. The idea that recipe could be installable on its own.
Yeah,
But
having to actually copy the recipe down to your development environment actually makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, wait, so what you're saying is, right now, okay, so the way I use recipes is I've got a standard Drupal site, and I have to add it to the Composer and file, whatever way you do it. Then I ask Composer to update it, brings down the recipe, and then I can apply it. He's hidden all that, because it's actually inside of a piece of code, an existing Drupal. And you're saying, how do we make recipes self-apply without having people go down to Composer? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And also because when you apply a recipe and then you don't need the recipe anymore, you remove it. But there is this unpacked step where sometimes you do need dependencies to make it into your composer. So that, I don't know, there are a lot of
Well, I think I see a contributed module called Recipe Manager, right? Where you say, here's the recipe I want, and then I'm going to just go apply it. And it applies it without having to do all the futzing with Composer.
I mean, it could go right in the modules composer, right? Because we're saying, hey, we need the smart date, so that's in there. But what if you put your recipe right into the modules composer, and then when you install it, it downloads the recipe that you need for this? That's an idea too.
I guess it would be kind of heavy though to require the migrate API, like some of the migrate modules and stuff. I guess you're just using core migrate.
Well, using core migrate and plus and tools. Yeah. So, but to your point though, what if this recipe was generic enough? It's like, I just want an event content type. I want a couple of taxonomy terms, whatever, that they're all connected. We've got the fields. What if that just lives on its own? And so somebody could install that and not necessarily install the localist module. I don't know if that's where you're going, but.
Not exactly, but it's definitely crossed my mind.
So.
Okay, I'm asking Jim, he's the project lead of recipes, to see if anyone, I can totally see a recipe manager where you can do that. See, because I don't think Project Browser.
Well, there's an eventual, I think, trajectory of project browser and then it modifies composer for you, maybe.
Right, but I don't think anyone's talking about Project Browser directly being able to,
Too much recipes, I think.
but to apply them. Yeah.
Well, I thought that was part of it.
Applying is different than installing.
Because isn't that the thing is like you can go in and search for other modules using Project Browser. You could search for recipes. Isn't that part of it?
For sure. But in all the conversations I've been involved with, it's always been so that it's on your file system.
Oh, and then you
have to
run it.
apply it.
I see. But rather than like this, where you just hit a button and
Yeah.
it will install it for you via the UI.
Yeah, so you can get it.
So I thought actually that this is the way that recipes eventually would work. I mean, I found this function. I was like, cool, let's use it. So,
I think it makes a lot of sense for demo content, which this isn't exactly, but it sort of is.
Well, it sort of is.
Yeah.
I mean, so actually, I when I last looked at the the content import for recipes, it wasn't working yet, but I guess it is now. So you could provide default content. But.
All right, keep coming up with questions. You mentioned security, which I love, and you mentioned recipes. I'm wondering if you or anybody knows, modules have a security, process. What about recipes? Because, okay, they install modules, which then have their own security thing. They also install
Apply.
Apply.
A bunch of config, yeah.
Apply a bunch of configuration, and configuration can be insecure. It can cause your site to be insecure. So
That's a
is there
great
any
question.
security for recipes?
I have no idea. Another question to ask one of the maintainers.
I can't guarantee I'm going to have a response in 15 minutes, but I'm going to try.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.